Okay, Roe v. Wade overturned, madness ensues. I am way late to the game on this, but I got to talk about it because this is a perfect prime grade A example of the conflation of rights. And a lot of you noticed. I think your name's first, last in the comment section. You kept being like, hey, do a video on abortion because you knew, you saw it. This is a perfect example of the conflation of rights. As soon as this draft opinion came out, I was like, dang, I got to do a video on this because look at all this emotion. Everyone's getting all worked up, and I feel like there's a ton of conflation of rights here. Why do I say that? Well, if you've read the original Roe v. Wade decision, I feel like most of these people haven't. They should go read it. It's interesting. It's only like 66 pages, 1973. You go read it and you realize, oh God, wait, this is not an accurate interpretation of the Constitution. Terrible argument. I'm no legal constitutional scholar, but I don't think you have to be to read through that document and realize how mangled of an interpretation of the Constitution it was, how poorly argued. So I feel like it failed on this whole like true, logical, accurate bit. But here's the weird thing. For me, I mean, this is going to be different for everyone. For me, I feel they effectively passed a law, which is a problem. Supreme Court's not supposed to be passing laws, but they effectively passed a law that led to a situation that I think is mostly effective and moral, not completely. I don't completely agree with it. So it's like a bunch of different things going on here. I think for a lot of people are like, oh, I like this that came from that. That's all good. And therefore, Roe v. Wade was a perfectly accurate interpretation of the Constitution. It was like, ho. Two things can be true at once. Roe v. Wade could have been a mangled, terrible, god-awful interpretation of the Constitution that led to something that you feel was good. So let me go through that. Let me try to justify real quick why I think the Roe v. Wade ruling was crappy. So let me just explain this real quick. So what was it? Well, I'll go through this real quick. Roe, who the pseudonym Roe, this pregnant single woman was in Texas, and Texas at the time was like, hey, no one is allowed to have any abortions unless it's for saving the life of the mother. And Roe was like, but I want to have an abortion. And so this goes up the courts. It eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, hey, Texas, you can't violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which protects against state action the right to privacy, including a woman's qualified right to terminate her pregnancy. So this is a weird argument. In fact, this is what most people say. You ask them, hey, is abortion, the right to abortion, constitutional right? And they'll say, yes. Why? You ask them why. Because of right to privacy. This is just a weird argument. Like, even if right to privacy was explicitly in the Constitution, it isn't clear at all to me why a right to privacy implies a right to have an abortion. It's just such a weird, tangential way to go about it. You know who agrees? A lot of people. You know, agrees Ruth Bader Ginsburg, liberal messiah, feminist incarnate on the Supreme Court, said like, dude, she was like, I think it was the wrong argument that restricting access to abortion violated a woman's privacy. She thought they should have argued it in other ways that she thought they went too far. I agree. They basically legislated from the bench and gave a really bad argument. So that's one thing. But here's the worst part. There isn't even an explicit right to privacy in the Constitution. That's already an interpreted right from the 14th and 4th and 9th Amendment. Right to privacy is interpreted. So that's one step removed. And now we're interpreting a right to abortion from that interpreted right. It's like, damn, this is a stretch, dude. Y'all are stretching here. So that's one problem, is that's a stretch. Here's another problem is they say, though the state cannot override that right to an abortion, it has legitimate interest in protecting both the pregnant woman's health and the potentiality of human life, each of which interests grows and reaches a compelling, quote unquote, compelling point at some point. And it's like, okay, well, here's the problem is like, the Supreme Court here is going to eventually try to decide what's compelling. It's like, everyone's going to have a different opinion. Like, you go look at a baby develop. It's like, you tell me, okay, here, tell me when this is a compelling human person. It's like, nah, for me, I'll just give you my opinion. It's like, nope. Like, not really. Like, ooh, it's got some eyes now. Like, getting there somewhere. Like, ooh, oh, we're close. So for me, personally, it's like, oh yeah, around here somewhere. It's like, that looks like a baby. And again, this is just gut reaction. My morals are basically based on gut reaction. I have no explanation for them, really. And so, but other people are going to have different agreements. Like, we're not supposed to be coming to the Supreme Court for them to give us their gut reaction on what's a compelling point for human life. That's something I'd rather have a legislature do, Congress do, because I can call my congressperson. I could be like, hey, I find it compelling at this point. Guess who I cannot call? I can't call a Supreme Court justice. I didn't elect them. They have no, responsibility to do what I think is right. This is not the job of the Supreme Court. And then it's worse now. This next part, this is the summary. They basically legislate. This is basically a piece of legislation. This is not the job of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has one job. We give them laws and they tell us, hey, was this law constitutional or not? Their job's not to come up with a law. And I'm like, dude, they come up with this whole trimester system. I'm like, really? You guys got all this from the Constitution. You're supposed to interpret the Constitution. And from the Constitution, you got that we have a right to privacy, which gives us a right to an abortion. And then from that right to abortion, you gleaned all this trimester stuff from the Constitution. I'm like, dude, there's no way. This is just a piece of legislation. Here's the thing. For the most part, I agree personally with this legislation. Some people won't. So let's go through it. What is this piece of legislation that they came up with here? They said it's a trimester system. During the first trimester, basically a woman can get an abortion whenever she wants, as long as she got a doctor to do it. It's like, okay. That's like, so it's around here, like 12 weeks, 14 weeks or so. Before this point, women could get an abortion whenever she wants. I pretty much agree with that. Like, I don't know. I don't consider this stuff like sacrosanct human people. I'll even concede to the pro-life crowd that life begins at conception. Sure, life begins here. I just don't feel like that's a person. For me, it's like, okay, protected person, I don't know, gut feeling, somewhere around here. So I think they roughly got that accurate. And I think it's effective. So for me, it's moral, but that's really based on my just like gut feeling. I think it's an effective line to draw as well, because if you look at it, 93% of abortions are performed at less than 13 weeks. So really, this is effective. This effectively handles almost all the abortions that you could talk about. Less than 1% happen after 21 weeks. So, that's a pretty effective line to draw. So I'm fine with A here, the first trimester. B, I'm not so fine with, but it says, okay, during the second trimester, it says the state can regulate abortions as long as it's related to maternal health. So what that means is like the state, if they want, can say, hey, if you're in the second trimester, you have to go to a hospital to get an abortion because it's unsafe to get it at a clinic, or you could regulate, hey, these clinics have to be clean and stuff like that. And, based on the health of the mother, because the later on in your abortion or in your pregnancy that you get an abortion, the more dangerous it is. So they're saying in the second trimester, states can be like, hey, regulate where the mother can get an abortion and stuff like that. And then in the third trimester is when the Supreme Court here says that, all right, now the potentiality of human life in that fetus is such that the state can come in and ban the abortion except in the terms of the health or life of the mother. So for me personally, it's like, I'd combine B and C. I'd say, after this point here, just gut feelings, like, all right, I can see how after this point, the state could come in and be like, hey, you can't abort that thing. After 14 weeks, you should know if you're pregnant by 14 weeks. Maybe if a state says, hey, you got to have that baby come to term and then put it up for adoption, whatever. I'm okay with that. I mean, look, full disclosure. Personally, I would never advise my wife to have an abortion, except to save her life or something like that. So for me, I'd never have, an abortion. But I'm also uncomfortable with telling women, hey, at 5 weeks, when that thing doesn't look anything like a human, you're not allowed to have an abortion. So for me, I delineate between these. So for me, almost all abortions immoral. Personally, I would never want to have my wife have one, but, except under extreme circumstances. But I'm also uncomfortable with the law telling other people they can't at like 5 weeks or whatever. So these often go together, moral, effective. In this case, in this particular case, because the effects are to people and to fetuses and to babies and to women, effects are happening to people. Therefore, these two are sort of combined together, but that's different from this. Whether you make that a law is different. Again, I would never have an abortion except under extreme circumstances, but I'm not going to make sure that's a law that says other people can't. And it's certainly different from this. This Supreme Court ruling is just a god-awful ruling. So let me go more into that. Let me justify that. Why am I saying that this is a god-awful ruling? Again, one, it was legislation. Know your role, Supreme Court. You're not supposed to do that. 2, it's based on a right to privacy. And 3, I just got to go through this. I'm really quickly going to go through this and just show you. Maybe you've never looked at this. It's worth looking at. Okay, so they mention, in addition, population growth, pollution, poverty, and racial overtones tend to complicate this problem of abortion. I'm like, population growth? That's such a weird thing to bring up. Were they reading the hack social scientist Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb? So this guy wrote this book. It claimed that, hundreds of millions are going to die from starvation. It's like, that didn't happen, but he got everyone freaked out. And I'm like, maybe the Supreme Court was reading that. So I just thought that was interesting. The Supreme Court says this. They got the gall. They say, our task, of course, is to resolve the issue by constitutional measurement. And it's like, really? Really, Supreme Court, that's what you're going to do? Then you got to tell me why. You take this diversion and you say, all right, before we figure this out, we're gonna briefly survey in several aspects the history of abortion for such insight as that history may afford us. It's like, what? So they go on to do this. They say, we're told that at the time of the Persian Empire, people that did abortions were known and that criminal abortions were severely punished. And I'm like, this is irrelevant, completely irrelevant. You got one job, Supreme Court. We give you a law. You tell us whether it is constitutional under the U.S. Constitution or not. Whether the Persian Empire thought abortions were good, bad, in between, irrelevant. Greeks, irrelevant. Roman era, irrelevant. They didn't have a Bill of Rights. I'm not going to go to them to figure, I'm not going to go to some Marcus Aurelius to determine whether some Texas law is constitutional or not. Ephesian Serranos, the greatest gynecologist of all time in the ancient world, irrelevant, doesn't matter. Here's another thing that's irrelevant. It's interesting, though. So this is irrelevant and interesting. So ancient religion did not bar abortion. And I'm like, was that right? So I looked it up in the Bible. I'm like, yeah, the Bible doesn't even really mention abortion, which is kind of interesting because, you know, the most pro-life people are typically very religious, but it's also irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether the Bible said it was or not okay to have an abortion, irrelevant as to whether the U.S. Constitution says whether it's okay or not to have an abortion. This is also interesting and irrelevant. They say the Hippocratic Oath, you know, the I shall do no harm as a doctor oath. I never read the whole thing, but apparently I looked it up and it says, I will not give a woman an abortion. It's like, whoa, that's weird. So obviously the writers of this majority opinion don't like that because they're putting forth a more pro-abortion argument. So like, uh-oh, we don't like that. So they're like, oh, we found this guy, Dr. Edelston. He said this Hippocratic Oath only represented a small segment of Greek opinion. Therefore, we can kind of ignore this Hippocratic Oath and its historical context. And I'm like, dude, y'all are out of your mind. I don't know why you're bringing up the Hippocratic Oath in the first place. Like, I'm not going to the ancient Greeks for this stuff anyway. This is irrelevant one way or another. This is funny to me. They say most Greek thinkers, on the other hand, commended abortion, at least prior to viability. See Plato Republic. I'm like, you're really going to quote Plato's Republic? Dude, okay, look, I love Plato. I love the Socrates. I love the writings, all of that. The Republic, this is a piece of garbage. Like, Republic, this is an ultimate dystopia. If you've never read the Republic, go read it. It's a straight dystopian hellscape if you try to base a society on this. They may as well be quoting Mein Kampf here. It makes absolutely no sense to me. We keep going. Okay, so finally they get to something relevant. English common law. Why is that relevant? Because a lot of U.S. laws were based on English common law. Anyways, they go through a lot of British common law, which is interesting and relevant. This was interesting. In 1828, New York, it was second-degree manslaughter for some abortions. I'm like, dang. In New York, liberal, bastion, abortion haven, New York, it was a second-degree manslaughter. And then get this. By the end of the 1950s, a large majority of the jurisdictions banned abortion in the U.S. However, and whenever performed, unless it's done to save or preserve the life of the mother. And then, but here's the thing, the exceptions, the more liberal places, were the District in Columbia and Alabama that permitted abortion to preserve the mother's health. I'm like, Alabama? That just blows my mind, Liberal Alabama? Really? Okay. And then, so they say, the Supreme Court says, the past several years, however, a trend toward liberalization of the abortion statutes has resulted in adoption by about 1/3 of the states of less stringent laws. And it's like, yeah, so why are you getting in the way? It's happening. It's happening, Supreme Court, so why are you going to get in the way? They keep going. They say, they concede the Constitution does not explicitly mention any right to privacy. It's like, yeah. And then they say, these decisions make it clear that only personal rights that can be deemed fundamental or implicit in the concept of ordered liberty are included in this guarantee of personal privacy. And I'm sitting here like, abortion, is it fundamental or implicit in the concept of ordered liberty? I mean, it doesn't seem like it. This doesn't seem obvious to me at all. So it's like, that's a stretch to me. Keeps going. They say, this is funny. This is such a terrible ruling. They say, we need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins. And guess what they immediately try to do? Resolve the question of when life begins. I'm like, if you're not going to do it, if you don't need to do it, then why are you doing it? So they talk about the Stoics thought this, and the Jews thought that, and the Catholic Church thought this, and I'm like, great, just wasted space here. Okay, this is annoying. So they say, in view of all of this, we, the Supreme Court, do not agree that by adopting one theory of life, Texas may override the rights of the pregnant woman that are at stake. But they obviously do, because they come up with this trimester system. That's their theory of life, and they're willing to override a pregnant woman's rights in the third trimester. It's like, no. It's like, no, Supreme Court, you do agree that by adopting a certain theory of life, it's okay to override the rights of a pregnant woman. You just disagree on what theory of life. So this is just a really weird document. They reiterate the trimester system, which again, I agree with like 2/3 of it, not the whole thing. But that's just my opinion. That's not really indicative of whether it was accurate or not. Okay, so this line's funny. This holding, we feel, is consistent with the relative weights of the respective interests involved, with the lessons and examples of medical and legal history, with the lenity of common law, and with the demands of the profound problems of the present day. Okay, guess what they didn't say this holding is consistent with? The Constitution. They had one job. It's like, keep your eye on the ball. Is this constitutional or not? And tell me why. Okay, then Justice Rehnquist comes in as the dissenting opinion. So he's representing the side of the Supreme Court that disagrees. Oh, man. So these guys drive me crazy. I thought you had to be smart to become a Supreme Court justice. This is how Rehnquist starts his dissenting opinion. He says, our previous decisions indicate that a necessary predicate for such an opinion is a plaintiff who was in her first trimester of pregnancy at some time during the pendency of her lawsuit. The court's statement of facts in this case makes clear, however, that the record in no way indicates the presence of such a plaintiff. Do you see what he's trying to say? It's so dumb. He's saying Roe was in her first trimester when she started this lawsuit. She's no longer in her first trimester though. So, we need a person that would be in her first trimester during the ruling. And I'm like, dude, you got to be kidding me. So because y'all drag your feet and because time moves on and pregnancies progress, you're saying that you need the lady to stay in her first trimester for 2 years. It's like, okay, then you'll never be able to rule on any of these pregnancy rulings whatsoever. It's such a dumb opinion. He rescues himself a little bit here. He says, all right, even if there were someone like that, he still disagrees. Why? He doesn't believe that the right to privacy is involved in this case. That's not the relevant issue at hand. He says, a transaction resulting in an operation such as this is not private in the ordinary usage of that word, nor is the privacy that the court finds here even a distant relative of the freedom from searches and seizures protected by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which the court has referred to as embodying a right to privacy. So that's one problem. This right to privacy argument is a really bad argument. There was a ton of fluff in this legal document that just was irrelevant. And then here's the worst part. Rehnquist says, the decision here to break pregnancy into 3 distinct terms and to outline the permissible restrictions of the state smacks of judicial legislation. It really was. It just looked like legislation. And again, I agree with 2/3 of it. I kind of would move B and C, the second 2 trimesters together, but that's just my opinion. But roughly, I think they got it right as legislation. But that's not their job. That's not their role. That's not their role as a Supreme Court. So this is why I say, and again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg agrees. She's like, yeah, it was crappy ruling. This is why I say the Supreme Court ruling, Roe v. Wade, not an accurate interpretation of the Constitution. It came, so I should do it this way. It came up with a law, which they're not supposed to. That's one problem. The Supreme Court's not supposed to come up with a law. And then that law, in my opinion, was, I'd put it at 2/3 right. Again, I don't completely agree with it. But again, I could delineate between all these in my mind. I could delineate between what is moral and effective, what's protected under the law, what's true and accurate. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people can't. A lot of people are going to be like, wait. I like the effects, therefore right. So let me show you an example. So this Guardian article. Guardian's this notorious left-leaning newspaper in the UK. This lady says, what I admire most about the Roe v. Wade ruling from 1973 is how the ruling, at once profound and lyrical, describes the atmosphere surrounding the issue of abortion. It is beautiful. And I'm like, okay, guess what you did not mention here? That you thought the ruling was accurate interpretation of the Constitution, that it was well argued, lyrical and beautiful. That's the type of thing I'd expect to hear from someone who thinks this stuff was good, but they can't quite bring themselves to say that this was true or accurate because they know darn well it wasn't that true or accurate. Okay, so let me put it to you another way. So imagine someone comes up and says, hey, I think it's immoral to murder someone. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I agree with that conclusion, immoral to murder someone. And you ask them, why do you think that? And they go, okay, well, because if you murder people, there'll be less people on Earth. And less people on Earth means less mass on Earth. Less mass on Earth means less gravity. And if there's too little gravity, we're all going to float away. I'll be like, oh, man, wait. Okay, you had a very inaccurate theory that led to something I think is moral. And that both of those can be true at once. So So that's what I mean when I say that this Roe v. Wade was a conflation of rights. We're kind of in the thick of it now. Like, things are all crappy now. So bringing it all the way back to the beginning, Texas, where this whole thing began, Texas just has a straight out ban pretty much now. Like, except to save the life of the mother. It's like gone back to the original rule. Except to save the life of the mother, you can't get an abortion at all. There might have been a reprieve where there's like a 6-week reprieve or something. This just caused a lot of confusion. Like, there's women apparently that have like had a miscarriage, the baby's still in them, but doctors are refusing to remove them because they're worried they might violate constitutional, or not constitutional law, but the Texas law that says you can't do an abortion, which sucks. Like, that sucks. There's tons of confusion right now. We're 50 years. We haven't figured this thing out. Why? It could be because the ruling here was a crappy ruling. If the Democrats understood the conflation of rights, they could have understood, wait, Roe v. Wade was a really bad, really poorly argued ruling. It is weak. It is weak to attack. And so we need to get off our ass and actually pass a law that enshrines the right to abortion if that's what we want. Get off our ass and do this thing. But they didn't. They didn't because they couldn't bring themselves to it. If someone asked them, hey, was Roe v. Wade a good ruling? They would have been like, yes, good, accurate ruling, because they just thought it was effective and moral. And they didn't do anything about it. And here we are, and now everyone's confused. So, again, a lot of y'all are going to disagree with me. When you think life begins and all that, it's kind of personal. But regardless of your feelings on that, no matter how you feel, pro-life, pro-choice, it is very useful to try to delineate between these. So delineating between these is useful no matter which side of this topic you're on. It'll help us discuss this better and resolve this issue going forward.